Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. This episode is with Hakwan Lau, author of In Consciousness We Trust. Hakwan is a team leader for Laboratory of Consciousness at Riken Center for Brain Science, Japan. Here we talk about shortcomings in current theories about how the brain generates consciousness, neural correlates, methods to study consciousness, and perceptual reality monitoring theory. Enjoy the conversation, share and subscribe to support the podcast. Thank you for listening. Hi, Hakwan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Am
Thanks
I
for
able
having me
to
here.
pronounce your name correctly? Because it's
Yeah,
a bit
as
difficult.
close as it gets. No, it's good.
Yeah. As a scientist who's working on consciousness, which is, of course, it's labeled like in different ways. People call it hard problem of consciousness, and etc. Let's start with your journey and background itself. How was it? Has it been hard?
Yeah, it's confusing sometimes. I started out in philosophy. So I did my undergraduate degree in Hong Kong. That was sort of in philosophy and cognitive science, and I wasn't really intending to become a scientist. I was more hoping to become a philosopher. But life works in funny ways, and somehow I am, and so I think the beginnings in philosophy kind of got me into thinking of these bigger questions. Like I was more interested in solving big problems, and then the science becomes like necessary. It becomes obvious that I need to do experiments. So the two always present some friction, because if you're a good empirical scientist, I think you should recognize that a lot of progress is incremental. You don't do an experiment to change the world. I mean, sometimes it happens, but if you're counting on that, then good luck. You're probably not gonna be very successful, or maybe you're just delusional. Then you are even worse. You're kind of harmful to the rest of the field. And then if you're really interested in the philosophy questions, you are either very much into the nitty-gritties, then it's not very productive, as from my view at least, or you're very much into the bigger things, and then you become very impatient with the empirical details. So it's a little bit confusing at times. Yeah, conflicting.
Yeah, but the fact that a kind of trained philosopher is talking about empirical evidence, I think that's already a good sign for the science of 21st century, right?
I think it's a very good sign. I wouldn't say I'm a trained philosopher. I'm probably an untrained philosopher, and a good example of a trained philosopher would be like Ned Block and Matthias Mitchell, and these are, I think, philosophers who are very good at knowing the literature, the empirical literature, but they are very rare. And in fact, you can also just as well, depends on like how you look at the half empty, half full kind of glass. You can also say it is actually quite a problem in today's philosophy of mind that so many people do not seem to think that they need to know the empirical literature. Yeah.
Yeah, so when we are talking about empirical literature and consciousness, of course, you are one of the leading expert in this area, and I see that also one of the few scientists who can label their lab as a laboratory of consciousness, which was really interesting for me. That okay, at least this shift is happening, that people are kind of going for it, and the saying, and also kind of mentioning to the peers and to the society that now we have those kind of tools to work on it.
I think that's certainly true. I think a lot has changed in the past 20 years. At this point, it's actually interesting. At this point, there are people like myself who's slightly older and who has achieved a certain stage of career security. Then you can just openly say that you're doing that. I wouldn't I wasn't so sure about doing that like 15 years ago when I just started my first lab. I think what we call it consciousness and metacognition,
Yeah.
or something like that. I can't remember. But we try to not make it so explicit, or at least we don't say that this is the only thing we do. I remember I once went to a job interview, and my potential employer asked me, do I want to emphasize on my work on consciousness? And I said no. I always thought about that, and maybe I was kind of selling myself short, because consciousness is one of the most of what I do. But I ended up going for that job interview trying to tell them, can you just focus on my work on metacognition, please? Because those are the things you can treat it as side work. I don't want you to evaluate me mostly based on that, because I know how much people would have basically they would not look at it fairly, or in a way that I would think would be unbiased. So things have changed, but at the same time, I think it's also become interesting. Some people, I think, now are almost benefiting from this turn of tides. I mean, and the turn of tide was not caused by myself. I mean, it was probably caused by the people like more senior than I am, but somehow the tides have changed, and I think at this point some people can almost benefit. I mean, not most of them. It depends, right? But if you are in the mainstream neurobiology in the US, you probably won't benefit by much by claiming to be an expert in consciousness. But there are people who benefit from it, I think, even in the US too. It depends on the stage of career and what they're going for. Because the media likes consciousness so much. You can almost claim to be interested in consciousness or doing things in consciousness, even though you aren't really, but it would help you with the publicity front.
Yeah, and also it's, I think, one of the most profound questions for humanity. So that has to be, I mean, we will have to give it that kind of respect anyway, right? So
this is interesting. I mean, sometimes I worry that we're giving it too much respect, and that actually exactly was what Francis Crick said almost definitely over 2 decades ago, I think in the 90s. There's an article I can refer you to. I think it's the New York Times or something like that, when they interviewed Francis Crick and other people when the first consciousness conferences were in the current wave were happening in the 90s. And I think Francis then wrote that he thought that maybe we're having too much of a good thing. He wished that the journalists would stop writing about this, because we are setting the promises so high. And then are we really delivering? I think that was the concern, and unfortunately, I think that sparkle of concern didn't lead to much concerted action to do anything about this, and we just went on with the promotion. I think right now the media attention is really a double-edged sword. I mean, it has its weird benefits and cost to the field.
Yeah, so I mean, since we are already talking about it, let's kind of outline the problem itself. Why it has been difficult. I mean, so of course your book, In Consciousness We Trust, where you actually outline the whole issues and different ideas, and it's full of evidence. I mean, if people who are interested in consciousness, they should pick up this book and kind of understand how much progress we have made. Of course, we are not there yet, and you also rightly mention in the book. But the fact that a lot of work is going on, and how our conceptual understanding is changing, that's already a good sign. So the question was, let's kind of outline the problem, why we haven't reached yet. I mean, of course, now we have kind of developed few tools, etc. But yeah. And then why it is, or is it difficult problem?
Yes and no. In a sense, I think so like many kind of big questions in biology, definition is always a very tricky thing. So you can also define what is life and what is inheritance. And usually, I think Francis Crick was one of the person who I pick up this message from, was that you don't actually sit around and define the problem, right? This is not how it happened in how we solve the problems of life or inheritance. Or heritability. We just go about building some science, and then at some point the concepts will fall into place. So in my book, I talk about this issue of definitions quite a lot. I mean, you can define the problem in a way that would basically define yourself into an obscure corner, and then you can't do any empirical work about that. And that might be very philosophically admirable, but what good is that? Like, I don't know. So on the other hand, if you see that problem the same way, you feel that, well, basically there are ways of defining the problem that would make it just impossible to solve. Maybe that even isn't even a scientific problem anymore. Then you can kind of pick your fights, pick your battles, and then you can try to address the aspects of consciousness that are more empirically addressable. Now, some people would say, well, then you're basically chickening out. I used to exactly hate this kind of approach and say, well, you're basically calling a problem insoluble before you even start, and then you just redefine the problem into something else. Yes, there is that danger. And so there's always a balance between them. You don't want to end up defining a phenomena or setting up your experiments to address a phenomenon that is basically boring and doesn't have anything to do with the original philosophical tension. But at the same time, you don't want the philosophical tension to become everything and poisons the entire science into standstill. So I think, yeah, that part is maybe not hard, but tricky. But once you see that, you basically want to focus on some aspects of consciousness that are interesting, that are related to our original problem of subjective experience. Why subjective experience can arise out of matter. So if you keep that focus and then try to think of what you can do that would still be within the realm of science or empirical research as we currently understand it, then it's actually not that bad. Then the rest is just like normal cognitive neuroscience, almost normal. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, since you already mentioned subjective experience, I think that's let's zoom in at that part itself and talk about excess and phenomenal consciousness, because that basically sets up our understanding, how we can really go about it.
Yeah, so Ned Block, my friend and colleague and mentor and whatnot, and he's a philosopher. He introduced the distinction between excess and phenomenal consciousness, and the idea being that phenomenal is really about how you feel about the phenomenal feel and quality of an experience. It doesn't have to be touchy-feely things like emotions. It could be, but it could be just as simple as seeing a color, and it has a phenomenal character. It's not just, it's not just a way, not just some simple numbers there. It's not just, it seems to be more than just information. It has a subjective quality. And then at the same time, when you see color, you also pick up those information, right? You also, you know that it's different from some other color, you know that it's darker, you can analyze it in an informational way, and that he called it access. Now, the two things seem to be conceptually very different, but things that are conceptually different are often turn out to be the same thing, right? So we know that H2O and water, they sound very different. One sounds very precise and chemical, and then the other seems like a natural kind everyday concept. And there are situations where they're not exactly the same, right? So you can say I water my plant. I can't say I H2O my plant. It seems, the connotation would be different. So the meaning of these two words or phrases are arguably not identical, but they end up picking out the same thing in this world. And so maybe phenomenal and access also turn out to be the same. I wouldn't say that they are, but I think we also should be careful not to load the dice, or not let Ned Block just roll the dice that way. Just because you define them as different doesn't mean that they're empirically different.
But so basically you are saying then, so we are looking at, because the way it is defined, it's we are kind of distinguishing two neural circuits, like in a way, right? But that's not the case when we look at empirically. Is it right?
Yeah, I think they are. I think NetBlock certainly hopes that there are different circuits, there are different mechanisms in the brain, and that's I think, at least that's how his views goes. But I don't think that's right. I think that it's true that there is a sense of access that is trivial. It's just like how you access information, how the brain, process information. So that's not what subjective experience is, certainly. It's not like whenever the brain processes information, the relevant information would be conscious. I think that's not true, right? So consciousness, in the sense of phenomenal consciousness and subjective experience, has to be something, maybe a subset of all kinds of informational access, or something slightly more complicated on top. I think I take that view, but I don't think that from there you would say that, well, therefore phenomenal is decidedly not functional, not informational. So it may be just a particular kind of information, or maybe just the information presented to you in a certain way. It's still information. So normally you have information, right? Assuming you are sort of like a cognitive neuroscientist, you assume that the brain, process information. Some people disagree, but let's not go too far. Let's start with some common ground first. So let's assume that the brain processes information. Then Ned would want to say, well, so you have information processing, and then you have phenomenality, which is a different thing. And I think that's going too fast. I think you can say, well, the brain processes information, but some processes seems to come with phenomenal consciousness. And you can ask what makes it different. So maybe the information has to be processed in some particular way, but it doesn't mean that it's not information processing anymore, right?
Yeah, so this basically already, so we are already entering in the realm of local and global theories, which again, I think you beautifully kind of summarize in the book, to put all of them in two categories and just look at them in different ways. So let's also please outline the local and global theories.
Yeah, so that's maybe may look elegant, but it's really a cheat of some kind. I just try to compress the whole literature into a very simple-minded view, and sometimes simple-minded views are useful. So so the idea is there is actually a particular version of global theories, which is called global workspace theory, which basically says that, when you're conscious, it's not just information, but the information has to be broadcasted to the different parts of the brain, to different mechanisms and processes in the brain. So basically, consciousness is not just information, but information being broadcasted globally in the brain. So then you would expect that, when you're conscious, you would have activities all over the brain, maybe not everywhere, but pretty widespread. And you expect consciousness to be functionally very, very important, because certainly, global coordination of different modules and mechanisms in the brain would be very useful for certain behavior. And you expect attention might be very important for consciousness, because when you don't attend to information, what you know is the informations tend to stay rather local. They don't pass through these bottlenecks and get accessed by other mechanisms. So that's basically consciousness, according to what global theories say. And that, to me, is a pretty extreme view. That pretty much sets consciousness is not just information, but is basically a lot of information. So consciousness is not just perceptual signal, but it's like basically very big and powerful and stable perceptual signals. So that's a very functionalist extreme that assumes that consciousness basically is just how it works when your brain works well. And I think that's a little extreme. But on the other hand, you have local theorists, which is the other extreme. Basically, they say, well, you don't need any of these the stuff that I just said about information being broadcasted everywhere. In fact, all you need, if you're visually conscious of color yellow, all you need is for the yellow tuned neurons in the local sensory circuit to be activated in the right way. And even if it's not broadcasted anywhere, if it's not accessed downstream, even if you didn't attend to it, none of that, you would still be enjoying phenomenal consciousness with the content yellow. And I think that's also pretty extreme. That's almost like saying that if you cut off that piece of brain tissue and put it on a petri dish, it would be conscious in some ways. And I just think that would be the kind of problem I talked about earlier. That's like, yeah, if it is, it's not. I'm not sure it's something scientifically worth studying. If you're talking about that kind of unobservable, totally a functional definition of consciousness. So I think that the trick is to try to find some common ground, or to find a middle ground between them. So you don't want consciousness to be just a lot of information, and you don't want consciousness to be just local activity, regardless of whatever function it serves. You want it to be some specific function that is not just bigger and better, but it has to be some specific process that actually captures the phenomenon better.
Yeah, that's interesting. So does this mean that according to global theories, there is no, like, it's the whole brain which is conscious, so it's not like any specific part, and according to the local theories, we'll find different parts of the brains that they are independently conscious and doing the job?
Yeah, that's I think some extreme way of putting it. So the global theorists, the most prominent ones like Stanislas Dehaene, and they wouldn't say it's like everywhere, but they would say it's like pretty global. So there are brain structures that are more widely connected than others. So some areas of the prefrontal cortex and parietal cortices, there are hub-like circuits in the brain with a lot of long-range connections to many other areas. So those they would think is part of the global workspace. It's not like the global workspace really is like every neuron. That wouldn't do you much good. I mean, presumably you wouldn't have a whole brain activation unless you're having an epileptic seizure. But there are some areas that are widely connected enough. They look like the kind of central broadcast mechanism. So they would think that those would be important. And then for the local guys, yes, some people even think that like every sensory circuit is conscious in its own way. Then how local it is, again, depends on the extreme. But I think the cutoff is clear that they think it's only the sensory areas that are important. The higher cognitive and attention-related mechanism, those are not necessary for consciousness for the local guys.
So most of the empirical data or the experiments that we have, I see that they are done on vision, basically. So most of the experiments on the perception itself, right? But,
yeah, most of them. Yeah. But there's a fair bit on hearing and smell and touch and stuff. But yeah, I would say the lion's share is in vision. Yeah.
But I think that the point being that basically shows the anthropocentric view, just because we are good at or are kind of like our vision is better, and I think that's where we end up focusing it, right?
Well, the vision is better for a lot of animals, not just us. I mean, since the Cambrian explosion, most mammals have pretty good, amazing vision. I mean, even the humble, mice, I mean, they actually can see a fair bit. The vision is very different from ours, obviously, but the rats can see a fair bit. So it's not. I can tell you why we're doing so much on vision. It's not so much like we are egocentric and all that. It's really just convenience, right? So it's much. I mean, of all the sensory modalities, if you want to do experiments, vision is very nice because you can, because of the computer monitor and the related technology, you can control your stimuli in a very precise way, and you can present many repetitions to the subject before they fatigue. Whereas for smell, I mean, how many different odors can you smell before you want to get out of the experiment? Or taste, like you can only do so many repetitions. And so auditory stimuli are quite popular in psychophysics, in fact, for that reason. But then for fMRI, which is one of the major tools for studying human brain, is actually not very easy, or well, many people do it, but it's less efficient to do it in the auditory modality because the scanner creating quite a lot of noise. If you do EEG, you might be fine. So a lot of it just methodological. And then because of the methodological reasons, the vision folks have developed tools that are just more advanced than some other people, and then the field has grown, and so there's a bit of historical reason, but I think it started off mostly because of convenience.
Yeah, I'm glad that you already mentioned the tools, because that's also important. But why I started talking about vision is the fact that there exists this neural correlates, right? Like what do you think that if we, for example, even if we understand through the vision, we'll be able to apply the same understanding to the other kind of sensory perception?
Well, there's a funny saying that in biology, we just tend to assume things generalize until it doesn't, right? So, I mean, science is based on induction. I mean, the fact that you studied some viruses doesn't mean that it would generalize to other viruses, but you just try to assume that the principles you assume that there are some general principles. And when you find some principles that generalize between a few cases, you just try to see if it generalizes to all. And sometimes it doesn't, right? I mean, it's just the way science is. But in the case of sensory modalities, we found, I mean, generally, is not a problem for consciousness. It's just for the entire field of neuroscience. It looks like that people can learn a lot from looking at what other people have found in other modalities. So if you're just studying somehow hearing, you're interested in not consciousness per se, just like the ability to hear or whatever, tuning. I think as a sensory physiologist or psychophysicist, you would benefit a lot if you read some papers in vision, and vice versa. And the dominance in vision is kind of, again, not specific to consciousness. It's kind of throughout the entire field.
Yeah, so let's also talk a little bit about neural correlates. What does this mean? And because does this mean that we are basically again looking at the empirical science of cognition and not cognition, the perception and consciousness in a way, like in more abstract way?
Yeah, I think, that's in the book. I talk a little bit about that. So I don't like the term very much, neural correlates. I used to like it a lot. I can tell you at least the understanding, the implicit understanding, sometimes it's quite explicit. When they started calling it correlates, the idea was, in biology, we usually talk about neural mechanisms or mechanisms. But you talk about mechanisms, you are already assuming some sort of metaphysical view. You're assuming that some functional components can produce this phenomenon. And in consciousness, people don't always feel so comfortable with that. Some people they take different views. They sometimes would think that it's not a mechanism, it just is consciousness. And it's not a cause, it doesn't cause consciousness, it is consciousness. And logically, there's a subtle difference between, well, basically a thing cannot cause itself, logically speaking. So, and then there are people who are actually dualists who think that, the mechanism just explains the functional aspect, and then there is some phenomenon, qualia, that sits on top, and all sort of weird views that people have. And I think back in the 90s, they just decided, let's set those issues aside and just call it correlates, because correlates is a very weak notion, right? So A can correlate with itself, it can correlate with the functional component. So let's just sidestep all the conceptual issues and focus on the correlates. And I think that was a very good idea, because the philosophical questions, as I hinted at earlier, they're important, but they're basically getting in the way of doing good science sometimes. But I think the promise that we can just focus on the empirical stuff and not get into conceptual issues just turn out not to be fulfilled. And in fact, we got into a lot of troubles, even in the very basic definitions about sufficiency and necessity, which I talk about in the book as well, that basically very prominent leading scientists would make absolute errors, contradicting themselves in print. And so I think we still have to think about the conceptual issues. So I'm not sure the whole talk about correlates have gotten us very far.
And this is where, just to expose the correlates part, you also talk about confounders, because that's, again, very interesting to me, or at least once I, start reading about confounders, I was like, okay, this now, it is getting serious. I mean, it's basically now we are looking at the even empirical evidence in more kind of a rigorous way to kind of also understand which empirical evidence we can sort of rely on, or which empirical evidence now we need to be more careful of. The question would be, so how much reliable the empirical evidence is, which is present till today. And let's then also a little bit talk about confounders.
Yeah, I think it's a bit shocking, and it would be a bit shocking and sad to say, but I think most of the current evidence are wrong. Most of the experiments are deeply confounded, and in fact, the situation almost serves us no favor, because it gives the impression that some theories are supported, but actually they are. I think the evidence for such certain theories are driven by nothing but confounds. It might sound a little harsh, but what I mean is to think about like a normal experiment of consciousness. Typically, you compare a condition where you consciously perceive something, let's say you see something, against a control condition in which you don't see something, right? So you compare them. So you compare these two conditions, and then maybe in the first condition, it led to neuroactivity X, but in the control condition, there's a less of neuroactivity X. So you say neuroactivity X is a neurocorrelate of consciousness. The problem is that the experiments are confounded in the sense that when you see X, it's not just you have more subjective experience. When you see the visual or the whatever target you have, when you're conscious, you're not just having more subjective experience. You're also remembering the stimulus. You're thinking about a stimulus. You can report about a stimulus. So you have a lot of these kind of confounds. And people generally have tried to deal with it, have dealt with it to some extent. But I think the one thing that really bothers me is almost in none of these experiments do people control for what I call task performance capacity confound. So when you see the stimulus, you can try to make people not report in both conditions. And so you get rid of the report confound. That actually is not complicated. Sometimes it becomes very trendy, but it has been done for a long time, and we know what results would stand. Or you can try to do tricks to make sure that the stimulus is well matched between the condition when you see and when you don't see. So you can deal with these confounds. And people have dealt with them. The one confound that really sticks out, and I think it almost poisons the entire field, is that when you consciously see something, you are more able to perform tasks based on that relevant information. And when you are not conscious, essentially, the way to make sure that you are really not conscious is that we knock out the perceptual information. So you basically cannot do any task. So that you see there's a high informational difference between the conscious and non-conscious. So all the theories that are driven by these evidence, so-called evidence, I think what they end up saying is that, well, consciousness is a big signal that carries a lot of information. And depending on what method you use, either that information is all over the brain that would support the global workspace theory, or that information is very locally strong in the local case. But I think in both cases, they are driven by this confound. And the point is not so easy to appreciate, because sometimes people don't even get like what you're talking about. Like, of course, when you're conscious, you process the information more, but that is empirically not true. We know that there are situations when you are subjectively not conscious, in the sense of you don't have the subjective experience of, let's say, seeing, but you can actually process the information. You can actually press keys. when you're asked to guess what's the stimulus in a forced choice task, you can actually guess correctly what the stimulus is. So you can actually have conditions where people are equally good at processing information as reviewed by how much they can press the correct keys to the stimulus. And yet in one condition, you actually have the subjective experience, in the other one, you don't. So that means that subjective experience is not the same thing as just being able to process information. And that condition where you have the information processing capacity but lacking the subjective experience is called blindsight. It's a classic neurological condition. I mean, some people quibble with that, but I think at least the conceptual possibility and overall cases that it exists is pretty strong. So we need to control for that, and otherwise all our experiments would end up is just as likely to be about strong perceptual signals. And I think, yeah, basically we have a literature that isn't necessarily about consciousness per se, it just is about strong perceptual signals.
So let's see if I get it right. So here I think, or what is the problem that, so first of all, the signal that we are talking about, it can be just flash of light, some letters, etc., right? That that we can just play around, and we look at, again, we use different tools that you mentioned, fMRI, EEG, or etc., right? So the problem is it the subjective personality itself, like our like, just because the noise in the experiment can come from the I don't know, the just because how do you say, the phenomenology itself, or it's the neural correlate that we are just looking at wrong kind of, or we just need like more variation in this stimulus in a way. What where is the problem basically? What do you think?
Yeah, I was saying that the problem is, even if you just keep the same stimulus and let the subject let the internal fluctuations of the subject to allow them to see the stimulus in one condition but not see the stimulus in the other condition, there is still a confound there. When they, in the condition in which they see the stimulus is the same, but when they see the stimulus, the subject was also more able to perform or to process the information. And in a situation when you don't see, essentially, yes, you don't see, but you also don't process the information very much. So your subjective experience is confounded with your ability to process the information. And that is not good, because you don't want to define consciousness as just the ability to process information, right?
So is it then like more like post-processing of the information where or that's the confounder, or these can be now different confounders we are talking about?
I think it's not the post-processing, it's the processing itself. Essentially, the ideal experiment I'm hoping to get is that in two conditions, you are equally able to process the information. But in one condition, you process it without the subjective experience. And the other one, you process it with the subjective experience. And the degree of your capacity to process the information should be the same in the both conditions. That would be the ideal experiment to do. And I think there are less than 5 of them or something. Like, people just have generally not tried. I mean, maybe more than, but people, I think less than 1% less than 1% of this current studies have even attempted to do something like that.
I think if you give the example of Blindsight, I think that'll kind of help in this situation.
Yeah, totally. So Blindsight, as I quickly mentioned, was after restricted lesion to the primary visual cortex, some subjects then developed they preserve the ability to do tasks. So if you actually show them stimulus and make them press keys to indicate what the stimulus was, they can do that. They can do it not perfectly, but sometimes about, a lot above chance, like 80%, 90% correct. So they can basically do the task fairly well. So they have the information processing capacity preserved. And yet, subjectively, they say that they're blind. The subjective experience seems to be gone. And it's not just a matter of what they say. There are other ways you can test them and indirectly infer, okay, it looks like that the subjective experience seems to be really gone. And you can replicate it in monkeys and other animals as well. They basically subjectively don't behave like they saw the stimulus, but if you force them to guess what the stimulus was, they can actually do it pretty well. So that means that you can actually, within the same animal, within the same subject or human, you can actually present stimulus to the blind field because the visual cortex is retinotopically organized. So let's say a blindsight subject only a blind in half of the visual field. So you can have a stimulus in the blind field that would trigger a certain amount of information processing. You can discriminate it with like 80% correct. And you can present a weaker stimulus to the good field, to the intact field, and adjust it such that it would give you the same information processing capacity. So the two can be basically matched in terms of information processing capacity. And yet you see the stimulus in one, but you didn't see the stimulus in the other because you're subjectively blind. That would be the ideal experiment to do, I think. But we rarely do that.
And these are the patients, or you induce the blind sight with, I don't know, a flash of light or something?
Yeah, so you can flash a pattern. Usually you don't want to flash light because the light would scatter. So you want to keep the luminance of the stimulus the same as the background, but it's usually a pattern of light. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No,
you can actually flash a pattern. Yeah.
I was thinking that if we kind of have patients like that where their eyes are fine, the V1 region is fine, but they can't report the subjective experience, because that will be really interesting to look at, like which part of the brain then doesn't
Yeah.
respond.
So blindsight usually is a result of lesion to the primary visual cortex. So the part of the pathway is broken. That's why they have blindsight. But yeah, so people have done. I mean, we have done some of these experiments too. But I was just saying, these are the absolute minority of studies, and patient work is difficult to do. So they are not, even in my own hands, I wouldn't say my studies were definitive. And so we are hoping now to do some more studies in animals and other setup. But you can do that. In the book we talk a little bit about how you can get some mileage out of that. But they're just they're the absolute minority of studies. In most of the studies, we never bother to control for the information processing capacity.
Yeah, and so basically for the same reason, you kind of also tried another tool, which is this transcranial magnetic stimulation. Let's talk about that. That was interesting, I think, because it was already present. It's not like the tool, it's new tool, but like you kind of used it to study this consciousness and kind of have this blind sight effect, if I'm correct.
Or not really. Yeah. So yeah, TMS is old. Is from the 80s. Neurologists use it all the time, even in the clinic. We have used it, and we're not the only one who do it nor the first nor the last. I mean, we're just, many people use it to study consciousness too. And in fact, yes, one of my friend and colleague, Tony Rowe, claims to have used TMS to induce blindsight, and that's a little controversial. But I think Tony is very good. He tends to be right about a lot of things. So, but I didn't really do that. What I did was I used TMS to stimulate the prefrontal cortex. Yeah, and then we got some effect that is not exactly like blindsight, but it's also quite interesting. Essentially, after stimulating the prefrontal cortex, which is not usually thought of as the locus of blindsight anyway, but then people, as expected, they don't become blind. After the stimulation, they don't show any visual performance deficit at all. They can do the task just as well. But what changed was their subjective appreciation of how well they can do the task seems to have changed. Or in other words, sometimes we call it metacognition has changed. So the perceptual metacognition has changed. So I can unpack a little bit. So usually when you do a task, I can ask you to rate your confidence, or tell me whether you saw the stimulus clearly. So after you do these really boring vision psychophysics tasks, you tell me whether this pattern is right tilted or left tilted or something like that. And you press a key and you do like hundreds, sometimes thousands of trials of that. But after each button press, I also ask you to rate your confidence, or just tell me whether you saw it clearly or not, right? So some sort of subjective rating. So usually when you say that you see it clearly, or when you rate confidence high, you are more likely to be correct. Right, so the subjective rating and your ability to actually do the task should be correlated. And that correlation is what we call metacognition. And you can fit fancy, signal processing model to do more than just correlation, but let's skip that part. Conceptually is basically some sort of calibrated correlation. So essentially, you just want to see whether your subjective ratings would predict your task performance. And after TMS to the prefrontal cortex, that correlation breaks down a lot. It breaks down 20%. And then if you look at patients with lesion to the prefrontal cortex, Steve Fleming has found that correlation breaks down by up to 50%. So basically, your subjective introspection within the perceptual domain is all over the place. So that to me is interesting.
Yeah. So that means somehow prefrontal cortex kind of acts as a platform for the subjective experience.
I would think so. I think they're related. I mean, how they are related then becomes the really complicated theoretical part. But I think at least the experiment I just told you seems to suggest, yes, your ability to do the visual task does not really depend very much on, or is not critically dependent on prefrontal cortex. You can stimulate the prefrontal cortex or lesion or disrupt it, and yet you can do the visual task. That's very well. And based on that, some people would say, therefore, the prefrontal cortex is not part of the neural correlates of consciousness. But I think conceptually that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because we are not defining consciousness as your ability to do tasks, right? So lesioning the prefrontal cortex doesn't change your ability to do the visual task. That doesn't tell you very much about consciousness. And in fact, that's very interesting that it does not change your ability to do the task, but it changes your subjective appreciation of when you cannot do the task. That you can call it introspection or metacognition, whatever you will. But that seems to be an interesting aspect that tells you something about your subjective experience. If you can do your task, but you don't know when you are doing it right and when you're doing it wrong, something seems to be really funny about your subjective experience. Yeah.
And how do we differentiate cognition, metacognition part?
Yes, it's just terminology. So cognition is just the way you think about things. And in this case, metacognition usually is about how you monitor a specific process. So usually in the memory case or in other case, it would be about your thinking. So let's say you're doing a kind of pub quiz, you're doing a kind of like a general knowledge test. You ask you like, where's the capital of Australia? Is it Sydney or something? And then you said yes, which then would be wrong. Then you might also give your confidence, right? You can actually try to guess whether you're likely to be right or wrong. So that usually, because of that kind of task, so it's basically your cognition is answering the first question, like where's the capital of Australia? And then another question is, do you think you're likely to be right or wrong? That is a question about the first question, right? So that is somehow called metacognition. In the perceptual case, is weird, because in the perceptual case, it really is kind of meta perception. It's really asking you, well, you just did a perceptual task. It's not cognition by someone's depends on how you define it. It's just a perceptual task, right? Whether this or that pattern occurred. And then you have to tell me how sure you are that you're right. So it's really some sort of self-monitoring in perceptual performance. Yeah, that's why, we just call it metacognition because sometimes it's how it's called in the literature.
Yeah, so the other interesting thing would be attention itself. You mentioned a little bit about this before. So would that be important, and how much that kind of changes, and how big that can be a confounder in the studies?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, people were thinking it's a confounder. So when you're conscious of something, you tend to pay attention to it. So the two seems to go hand in hand. And then there's been a fair bit of effort in trying to dissociate them. And I think those are very well, but they are not that surprising. I think the answer seems to be, even when you don't attend, sometimes you can see stuff. And there is a correlate related to that. But what I think is really interesting is that sometimes when you don't attend, in fact, you also see stuff, but you see stuff particularly well. And actually almost like unrealistically well. I'm thinking about like your everyday vision in your periphery. which you usually don't pay as much attention as the center. You pay attention to the center. And the periphery also just physiologically has a lower resolution and color sensitivity. So in a way, you should be seeing very little in the periphery. But I think the lack of attention somehow inflates how much you subjectively see. So your peripheral is somewhat, people call it filled in, or I disagree whether it's actually filled in or something else, but something funny is happening in your periphery. You subjectively see more than you should. Your information capacity is actually pretty poor in the periphery. It's not zero. I mean, you can see some through the corner of your eyes, but you don't see really very well. But subjectively, you think you see better than you actually do. And that, if you analyze it a bit, you think about that, that's interesting, because that suggests that when you don't pay attention, receive lack of attention, and yet it actually boosts, you have a kind of inflated level of subjective experience. So attention and subjective experience can actually go to opposite directions.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's now move on to your theory and see where we reach now through the empirical evidence, and how we can kind of understand consciousness. So it is perceptual reality monitoring theory. So what is the basis of it, and what do you think? Where are we going with this?
Yeah, I kind of, when I sent my book to my friend Richard Brown, he said, well, your book is funny because you've put your theory, you only introduce your theory in chapter 7, and you should have just put it up front. And my reply was, well, because I don't think much of the theory. I don't think it deserves to be in the earlier chapters. I think that people who want to read such a book should get to know about the problems in the field, all these confounds and all the definition issues, and just get a summary, hopefully a useful summary of the empirical literature before they get to any of this theory stuff. I think any of this theory stuff is pretty dangerous, actually. I think some current theories are dreadful and harmful to the entire business, actually. So I'm actually quite skeptical about any of that. But I would say my theory is also, I indulge in it a little bit because it's also not original. It's actually a pretty old idea. It comes from what philosophers sometimes call higher order theories of consciousness. You can trace it back to Immanuel Kant or John Locke. At least in modern times would be, David Rosenthal, Bill Riken. A lot of people, other people who have worked on this theory. It's not like a new thing. I just kind of take those ideas and rephrase it in a more, in terms that are more compatible with cognitive neuroscience and computer science. Hopefully computer science, maybe mostly cognitive neuroscience. Yeah, I just basically rephrase the philosophical idea in more cognitive and computational terms. Yeah. So essentially the idea is, we talked about earlier, right? So just having information processing capacity doesn't seem to be enough. And philosophers would say, well, that means that the first order representation of perception, of the perceptual objects, is they are not enough. They're not sufficient for subjective experience to arise. So just having information processing is not enough. Then what is needed? Well, the global workspace guys say the information needs to be broadcasted everywhere. But I was saying, well, if you broadcast it everywhere, you will be functionally doing a lot more. And in the Blindsight case, I can tell you, it doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, you don't need to, even if you can find conditions in which the non-conscious cases seems to be just as broadcasted. You seem to be doing almost just as much. And there are other cases like working memory is another case. You seem to be having a lot of broadcasts, but you're not confusing your working memory as seeing. So there seems to be something more than just having the information broadcasted everywhere. It seems to be some very specific self-monitoring mechanism that basically tells you that, okay, this first order sensory signal, this, early visual area signal is actually reflecting something specific. It is either coming from the external world, in which case that would be reflecting a case of normal perception, or the self-monitor might tell you, well, this piece of sensory signal in the early visual area is just generated by yourself. So it's just your own imagination, in which case you must not confuse it with perception. it will be very bad for you if you fail to distinguish between them. Or in some other cases, your self-monitor might just tell, well, this is actually just spontaneous noise, because we know the neurons are never silent, and if you're living, or if you're not deeply anesthetized, then the neurons actually show a fair bit of spontaneous activity. So some sort of mechanism has to be able to decide and say that, well, despite this high level of spontaneous activity in your visual neurons that are tuned for this object, this is actually just noise, right? So some downstream self-monitoring mechanism has to make that decision to say whether a piece of sensory signal is externally triggered or self-generated or just noise. So that monitor, I think, is a very reasonable thing to have in your brain. And there's some evidence that we have something like that in the prefrontal cortex. So from there, I theorize, well, that might be really the crux of the matter, what decides whether you're conscious. So just having the sensory signal is not enough, but having the sensory signal to be determined by the higher order self-monitor to be reflecting the current state of the world, that is what consciousness is. Yeah. So that's
and what about the non-conscious signals that we are receiving? That's also noise?
No, so they're not necessarily noise. They can be a very strong visual signal, but if your self-monitor determines that based on some useful, hopefully pretty powerful heuristical algorithm, based on some of that, if the higher order mechanism decides that a first order sensory signal is noise, then you don't see. Yeah. So
here, yes, go ahead.
Sorry. So a good case would be, going back to Blindsight, would be one such a case. So in Blindsight, you have a pretty strong first order sensory representation, strong enough allow you to do the task at 80% correct. But maybe after the damage to V1, the nature of the signal change, maybe the anatomical pathway change a little bit, the dynamics change a little bit, such that your higher order prefrontal self-monitoring mechanism fail to recognize that signal as coming from the external world and mistakenly say, well, this is just noise. Then you have a lack of subjective experience, and yet you have the information in the brain.
Yeah, so what here we are saying is that the Rior theory is that the consciousness is the difference between, because we receive all the signals, okay, but the consciousness is the difference between the noise which is created in dreams, for example, right? Or if we are just, I don't know, imagining stuff, that can also be a kind of noise. But then there is also signal that we are receiving both actively or consciously, which goes into more of this metacognition level. But then there is also signals that we are receiving, like, for example, I'm moving my hand while talking unconsciously, and this goes into I'm just doing, I mean, it's not like I'm thinking about it, but now since I thought about it, this can be, again, it goes to metacognition level, which is consciousness. Is it right?
There's a weird music from outside.
It's okay.
Yeah, I'm in Japan now, so I think we are next to a middle school, and when it's 5 p.m. they tend to play this jingle. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the signal. So you have the incoming signal, or you have a visual signal, right? Yeah. Let's say you have a visual signal in the sense that your visual cortex has some contentful activity. So by which I mean there are some neurons that we know that are tuned to certain stimulus properties, right? So when certain neurons fire, we know that there is this color in this location, okay? But those neurons fire for different reasons, right? Sometimes they fire spontaneously. Sometimes they fire because you imagine the stimulus. Sometimes they fire because actually the physical stimulus triggered that neuron to fire. And your self-monitor essentially just have to decide what is the source of the firing in the visual area. So it's a kind of self-monitoring. Yeah.
The question is, what is that self-monitoring?
Oh, what is the self-monitoring? You mean what is the substrate for the self-monitoring, or what is the? I would think it's in the prefrontal cortex. Yeah, there's a fair bit of evidence that there is some circuit in the prefrontal cortex that seems to do this kind of job. Yeah.
But then we know patients or people that they completely lack the prefrontal cortex, right? So
that's actually not true. Yeah, that actually is a problem. So it's an empirical falsehood that has been said by a lot of people. I mean, there are some extreme cases of people who have the entire cortex damaged and they seem to be fine. And those are very extreme cases that would challenge any common understanding of neuroscience. And if you find a lot of those patients, the entire field will be shaken up for sure. But so far, those patients seem to be very rare. And there's an empirical falsehood that you can lose the entire prefrontal cortex and be fine. That is just not true. In fact, bilateral prefrontal cortex would knock you out big time. Many of those patients don't survive, and even when they survive, they behave very, very differently. They don't really respond to external stimulus very well. But there is an empirical falsehood that continues to be, I don't know, promoted by some of my colleagues. I don't know why would they do that, but what is known is that if you lose unilaterally your prefrontal cortex, just one side of it, yes, then a lot of cognitive functions can be preserved. But it's well known because the prefrontal cortex is relatively resilient, and when one side is damaged, the other side tend to take over pretty well. And also the parietal counterparts of the lateral prefrontal cortex also seem to do some of these functions of dynamically, taking over the damage. But if you lesion really the entire prefrontal cortex, you won't be doing very well. Like that is a fact. And even if you just lesion unilaterally your prefrontal cortex, as I mentioned earlier, your perceptual self-monitoring is highly impaired. Even though you can do visual tasks, your ability to tell when you can do it well and when you cannot do it well is heavily impaired by up to 50%. So it's just a myth that prefrontal cortex lesioning doesn't do anything to perceptual. It does something to some perceptual related functions for sure. Yeah, it is quite true that it doesn't affect your ability to do simple visual tasks. But as we said, so what? That doesn't tell you much about consciousness anyway, right? Because unless you define consciousness as your ability to do visual tasks, which would be a very bad definition that would not explain blindsight.
the only thing is, how do you imagine consciousness? Is it like binary, 0 or 1, or it's more of a gradient kind of thing?
I think it's the same answer I would give to any biological matter. It's definitely not 0 or 1, right? I mean, like in some ways between life and death, there's kind of like a gradient too. But at the same time, I'm not so hung up about that. I feel before we even get the shape of a theory, these like fine points about how the transition happens, they always happens in some sort of quasi non-linear way. I don't know. They would not be linear, and they would not be like a step function. They're usually something in between. I would assume that this is how biology would work, and until I'm proven wrong.
Yes, I mean, yeah, this is really a good point that in biology, mostly we have gradients. It's the intermediates, they get chucked out because of selection, etc.
Exactly.
And that's why we see if we see something discrete anywhere, that would be the reason. Because
I would definitely not put a number to it and say you are exactly like 75% as conscious as you were like 2 days ago. I would never do anything like that. I think that's like a bad idea.
No, but we'll have to, or I don't know, at least we'll have to think of numbers when we put these understandings from the evolutionary point of view, because they're so for example, I don't know, if you look at the evolution of the brain itself, the cortex would be limited to, I mean, of course, certain species. And then what we'll say that, okay, or can we say confidently then that, okay, only these species are conscious, but not the others?
Yeah, I'm not sure it would do much good. I mean, I understand that as most areas of biology advance to a certain point, then the quantitative computational guys would come in and they try to formalize the theories into more mathematical ways. And yeah, well, first of all, I'm not sure we are even remotely close to that point. So you mentioned about your where Mendel was. And it's kind of going back to the roots of evolutionary theory. If you're back to that stage when we're talking about Darwin and Mendel and all these people, I'm not sure a very precise mathematical definition is that important at that point. I think getting the concept right would be more important. So that's first of stage. And the other is I think we have to, this is actually interesting. It gets to the kind of quite fundamental problem of our consciousness. Our target phenomenon is somewhat slippery, right? I mean, we know that we are conscious. Well, we don't really know. We just, because based on how we interact with each other, we assume that we are all conscious. It's not directly observable as such, but you can basically define your problem as being conscious means that you are able to respond and report to the stimulus, and you can think about what the stimulus, the nature of the stimulus is, how similar it is to other basically you can write down some sort of minimal functional definition. You don't assume that consciousness is being able to do a lot of tasks, but consciousness allows you to do some task, right? If you cannot report the stimulus at all, if you cannot think about the stimulus in any way, that would not be very good. So somehow we have to agree on that set of minimal tasks. And once we agree on that minimal set of tasks, then, which we are not quite there yet, the field is still struggling a bit with that. But I think it would become interesting whether we can apply that set of tasks to other animals. I'm not very optimistic that we can. I think so. The inference from humans to other animal cases will always remain a little bit of a matter of inductive guesswork. It is not pure guesswork, right? I mean, you can look at the circuitry and say, well, in humans, we know that this circuitry now is beyond controversy, that we established that this is important for consciousness, which would probably take a while. Then we can apply it to other animals a little bit, but I'm not sure that we'll ever come to a point that we can prove, nor does it matter. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. Given the slipperiness of the phenomenon, Peter Carruthers, the philosopher that I usually don't agree but admire all the same, he actually wrote about this very same problem. It's not our problem. I mean, whether other animals are conscious, we'll never find out. Like, so let's just stop being so hung up about that. I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, and what do you think then? Can we at least zoom out at the cellular level, or basically zoom in at the cellular level? So let's say that if we kind of also, if we understand, okay, that these are the neural organization with certain with the other cells like glial cells, etc., in the brain, and then what do you think? Can we kind of take the understanding at the cellular level and also try to understand that, okay, what can be these mechanisms that they give us this kind of subjective experience or something?
Yeah, my answer may be a bit weird, but my answer is no. The reason being that different phenomena require different levels of explanation. So we know that, let's assume that humans are physical, which I think most biologists assume. So biology reduced to chemistry, reduces to physics, and then economic transactions are a human activity, right? So we know that the economy consists of human decisions. But you're not going to try to give a chemical, molecular, biological definition of economics, right? It just, in principle, you can. I mean, economics is nothing but human activity, and human activity should be understandable at a more bottom level like that. But those explanations would not be useful or meaningful to you. Like, you should just have the good faith that, yes, all of this we're doing, when we're talking over Zoom, all of this software that involved in this, the internet, all of this extremely complicated architecture does not violate the laws of physics. I don't think it does, right? I mean, I think this Zoom conversation has not violated the laws of physics, but it doesn't mean that you can give a physical, like in terms of like fundamental physics equation level description of this whole thing. Like, no, you need to talk about software engineering. You need concepts at a higher level to give a satisfactory account of what's going on. And I think so at the cellular level, I suspect would be the wrong level of explanation for consciousness. I think the right level might be at the level of cognitive neuroscience. That is, we want to understand the neural computations that allows you to perform certain computational functions, and those might ultimately be what consciousness is. And if that's true, then the substrate isn't all that important, right? Because a biologically instantiated circuit ultimately only matters to the extent that it's a circuit and it performs certain computational function. So the cells actually is not that important. I mean, it's not fundamentally important. It's done by the cells. The neurons are important, and knowing that what neuron does what would be important. But you only need a sort of statistical understanding of the neurons. You don't need to boil it down to the cellular level. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because whether we'll be looking, so for example, if it's not at cellular level, that means it's the organization of the cells which is important. So more of a topology kind of thing rather than really at micro level understanding. But then the question would be why anesthetics then affect consciousness?
Oh, of course, but yeah, you're like asking why would a nuclear bomb stop this Zoom conversation, right? Yeah, of course, yeah, because you don't need to abolish something is relatively easy. You don't need to necessarily get at the very precise level to abolish it, right? So you can, it's not even anesthetics. You can ask, like, if you just cut off your blood supply, you also lose consciousness. So, but that doesn't mean that there's a plasma explanation. There's no plasma level explanation of consciousness. It's just that, because even though the explanation is not at the level of cellular, of course the cellular support is important. And if you somehow shut that down, then you would lose consciousness. But you lose a lot of things, right? So the plasma analogy is not so silly in a sense. If I ask you that, if I just cut your jugular so your blood let out and then you lose consciousness, you think that's silly, but you die as well. So that's a major confound there. But in the case of anesthetics, it's the same. When you anesthetize, you didn't just lose your subjective experience. You lose consciousness in a much broader sense. You're not talking, thinking, you're not doing tasks like a Blindsight patient anymore. You're basically out. Your entire neural computation seems to be pretty much abolished. In a meaningful cognitive sense, at least.
So from, of course, once we are talking about anesthetics and cellular level, then let's talk about the, the consciousness in microtubules and this kind of stuff. So what do you think?
I don't think much about it for the same reason, right? I mean, it is a solid hypothesis. People seem to think that the empirical evidence is controversial. I do not even personally want to go there because I think it's the same thing as anesthetics and all these problems, right? It seems like a general mechanism that is too general, basically. Unless you show me that, like in Blindsight patients, then the microtubules are off, and then in the normal intact vision, the microtubules are on. Unless you get at this kind of more precise comparison. If you're comparing a functioning brain versus a non-functioning brain, well, then there are other people who study brain functions in general, but that's not me. So I'm not that keen to think more about it.
So this was more or less like biochemistry level. Now we can also go at the physics level, that the consciousness in more fundamental in the universe, like Panpsychism, or the concept explained by Donald Hoffman, that it is fundamental to the universe. So if we are talking about that, what is the kind of thinking in cognitive neuroscience about these kind of ideas?
I kind of remain the same. I have not been able to see the really meaningful connection to, at least to the problem as I try to understand it. There must be some other, there must be a lot of value in that work to some other people, but it just doesn't serve my purpose, right? So if you're really thinking about if you start with the view that you really want to do better experiments that are better controlled and that get at the issue of subjective experience, but not just like perception in general or cognition in general, then you really need to find the ingredients that differs between normal conscious perception versus blind sight, essentially, or something equivalent to blind sight. You don't want to end up having an ingredient that once you take out that ingredient, your brain just doesn't do much anymore, right? Because then you run the risk of having an ingredient that is just for brain cognition, perceptual computations in general, but not specifically about subjective experience. So none of these things that you mentioned seems to me to speak to that problem. I mean, I've not seen any even attempted arguments to say that, well, these, physical blah, blah, or whatever, fundamental XYZ or whatever is specific to subjective experience rather than quite general to just how the brain works in general. So, I mean, I'm sure that's interesting from some perspective, but it's not useful for our purpose right now. Yeah.
The question being, and why I started mentioning about the different hypotheses and different levels, because this is also kind of shows the levels of understanding. I mean, as a cognitive neuroscience, you are looking at mainly parts of the brain where we can find the consciousness, and then from there, even if we like kind of go more into deeper level, that will be fine. The point being, because this also drives the science funding. That you talk a little bit about these issues as well in the book. So I was thinking that it's better also to get your opinion, how you think at these kind of different concepts, and because then people who are kind of thinking of working on these problems, they can select better that, okay, what is more immediate now, or what can be important now, and then probably they can lay the ground for the future work.
Yeah, I think I take a pretty dim view about that, especially when you think about funding as well, because right now they're driving a fair bit of the funding, and a good part of it is via the media attention and the private philanthropist attention, which is often also driven by the media attention. To think about an analogy, like, so in biology, when we're establishing the theory, when they were establishing the theory of evolution, if someone comes along and say, well, let's think about a physicalist, fundamentalist theory of evolution, that before Darwin, collected any of the data. And then someone said, let's think about even a theological foundation of evolution, or think about a chemical foundation of all of that. Or think about a mathematical foundation. Sorry, some other rings. Yeah, let's say if someone tried to encourage you to do that, you would see how badly it could really take us to somewhere completely astray. Because it's not like those levels of understanding are not important, but those levels of understanding ultimately should be constrained by the most relevant level of explanation. If you're talking about evolution, you should get the phylogenetic data right first. And if you don't, just sitting on an armchair, let's just think about the interstellar, constellation that would allow evolution to happen. Well, you won't go very far. I know it sounds very grand, but you just really won't go very far. In fact, if you're also eating up a very small pie of money while doing that, you're really doing science a general disservice. Because if the problem is ultimately most important or more primarily understandable at a certain level, you need to get the data there right first. Once you get that, okay, now you have basically a worked out theory of evolution. Then maybe we can talk a little bit about how, other computational theories, you can expand a little bit. Maybe you can even talk about the molecular basis. You can talk about the more interstellar, all this stuff, and now think about whether the planets might have the right constituents to allow evolution. But after you first work out the theory, right? You don't do it in parallel, and you definitely don't put that priority first. And I think the current stage of consciousness is a bit like that. As I mentioned, if you're with me with the first, that's why I think the first few chapters of the books are more important. If you're with me that we are not even doing the experiments right yet in terms of cognitive neuroscience, if those experiments are currently misleading, and based on those, you want to write down some mathematical equations and talk about the physical level or talk about the cellular level, those work is very likely to be wrong, because you started out at the most relevant level wrong. And if those work then generate a lot of media attention and capture a lot of funding, that is basically hurting the very activity that we should be doing. And I think that's exactly what's happening in this field right now. That's unfortunate.
Yes, but how can we change it then?
Well, recognizing it is a good step. I mean, I think I'm often considered to be one of the most scathing critics of all of this work. And I think, on the other hand, I think what I said should not be very surprising to a mainstream biologist or neurobiologist. I think the field is just have not come to the consensus yet that this is bad. And I think if you recognize that it is bad, then it will be better. Because socially, I can see people don't want to do that. And there are historical reasons why we are not even in a very strong position to do that right now. But I think once we recognize it's bad, at least we should stop doing the damage. But it sounds horrible, right? What I just said. I mean, I'm not so silly to think that what I just said didn't come out very harsh. I think it does, but at the same time, I just think that I think it's a pretty vanilla thing to say if you, within the context of neurobiology. A neurobiologist would also tell the physicists to back off if they are trying to, capture our funding for doing cancer research. Let's have a physics theory for cancer. Let's define cancer in fundamental physical terms before you even get the biology right. I think they would also, just tell them to back off. But I think we are not even sure that we should tell them to back off in consciousness. We are still pretty confused as a community. I think hopefully things will get better.
Can we model the consciousness in machines? And what do you think, if they start reviewing the science, it'll get better?
Yeah, this one is tricky. I think since I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, I think ultimately the explanation is the level of neurocomputation. And of course, neurocomputation should be possible. You should be able to simulate it using machines. So I would think that is a consequence, but I think it's kind of like one of the awkward consequences of this approach. I don't feel very strongly that it has to be like this, or I don't think it's a great thing that we can build conscious machine. I think it looks like that if the theory is right, we should be able to, but I don't know exactly. Yeah.
Okay, because I was thinking that if robots are kind of also screening our grants and stuff, maybe they'll be more kind of rational in deciding what to do next, because it's more like that animal thinking, right? Like all the biases that we have, or different things that we see or we observe in science. I mean, I did one podcast with one philosopher in science, and his idea was that irrationality drives science. So now I don't know, I mean, how valid this is, but we do see those kind of it is animal behavior. We can't really, we can get wiser with the time, but it's difficult to dissociate ourselves, right? So
I think it's true and interesting, but yeah, I'm not so futuristic thinking usually. I think we have enough on our plate. We should worry about that when we get there, because things may change as well, right? When we actually work on the local problems. I think in science there are very few cases where I think big picture thinking is very important to keep us stimulated, and it goes back to the very beginning of the interview. I think that's maybe a nice way to wrap it up. You started asking me about philosophy and science, and I think the philosophical thinking is always very important and interesting, but you shouldn't let it, drive the entire business. And you should just do things locally, focus on the local problems, and the local problems would ultimately tell you how the big picture is, how the big picture is. At least that's my workaday science attitude.
Yeah, and it's perfect, I think. And apart from that, I also kind of mentioned this kind of fascination with the science, that at least the fact that we live in these times, that they are really like already much better. We have better tools, better, and these kind of thinking that we can come out and say our opinion, that and it is out there now. And as you mentioned, that recognition is important, and once that happens, slowly I think, and this is how humanity has transformed for thousands of years, and I think it'll just continue on the same
I'm
path.
not so sure. Yeah, that's a funny way to think about it, because in a sense, I do come across as if I'm protesting against something, but I don't think the consciousness itself is a protest. In a sense, I'm exactly protesting against all these high-sounding protests. I feel that if we just find some useful experiments to do and do them well, then everything will be fine. I actually rather think, the way to protest, the way to make progress in science is often not by making these high-sounding statements. Is rather just by just eat your vegetables and do your experiments and do them well, do them clean, and make them rigorous, and indulge in a little bit of theory if you must, but that's maybe all you need, because then if you think about it, most of the good work that was done in biomedical science have been done that way. I think that's a very interesting difference between how biomedical sciences in general have made progress versus how physics have gone. And I think because we lived in the post-Second World War period, where a lot of this, public image of science and perception is influenced by physics. And of course, in theoretical physics, bless the hearts of those pioneers, they really have made progress in a way that is very theoretical, and sometimes in a very quantum way. I mean, pardon the pun, they really made quantum leaps by sitting on an armchair and doing very clever maths. But I just don't think that case generalized well to the biomedical sciences. If you look at all the Nobel Prizes in the last century, I think very few of them are driven by armchair theorizing, if at all. Even if you call it armchair theorizing, it's not that kind of armchair theorizing as in physics. There are certainly a lot of influential work done in theoretical biology, but they're very different, and they are still very empirically grounded. And a lot of leverage and mileage can still be gotten out from just doing, cool experiments well. And even in the case of, I remember saying this to one senior colleague, and he immediately interrupted me and shouted, Francis Crick. I said, well, but in Francis Crick's case, don't we remember there was a woman called Rosalind who actually did all the important groundwork that was just like not duly acknowledged. I mean, why do you think some genius would come up with a double helix structure out of, just thinking? I mean, what were you guys thinking? I mean, of course it comes from empirical data. It wasn't being acknowledged properly. So as we now move to potentially Third World War and post-pandemic era, we should think more about whether our science really is too influenced by those nuclear bombs, and we should think the world has other ways of doing science for us.
Exactly. So this is then the great message, that empirical evidence or the great experiments, and eat your veggies, which is very important. So what are the major experiments then you think we need more, or probably you guys are planning, which can now change our understanding again, another paradigm shift?
Yeah, there are two different questions there. I think what we are doing in the lab has always many considerations in terms of the persona, and so to me, doing experiments are very personal, and so we're doing a lot of neurofeedback type studies, and we're studying aphantasia. I can tell you the long list, but maybe we will run out of time. But I can, if I just tell you what I think the field really needs, it may not be what we are doing, because running a lab is is very different. You have to think about the people first, and also the careers of the people. But I think the field needs something, which is something that we've already talked about. We just need to get rid of that basic task performance confound. We need to study consciousness in a way that does not equate it with some simple ability to do task. And we just don't. So basically, we need more Blindsight-like studies. I mean, there's only so many Blindsight patients, but we need something that's conceptually like Blindsight. If the community does not begin to really tackle this issue together, I'm not very optimistic about the entire literature, actually. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So with that, thank you so much for accepting the invitation and sharing all the wonderful ideas. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.